All right, guys, so in previous episodes of the Access Blockbusters Pod, we talked about James Gunn's comments about how the DCEU canon is going to function in the DCU. So we're getting a little bit more clarity. Obviously, we talked about Creature Commandos, but we're getting some more clarity now as the DCU actually kicks off officially. But now, in addition to Creature Commandos and in addition to those comments that James Gunn has made about the canonicity of the DCEU, we've gotten some more comments here about how the MCU is going to, the DCU is going to differ from the MCU. I have an article here from the Direct, which compiles just a few quotes here from James Gunn that we're going to go through, as I like to do. So we're going to read through some of these quotes here and then discuss what they mean on the other side, because I think it's interesting. I think this gives some insight into what James Gunn's DCU is going to look like, and I think that, I'll say this, there are many, many individual things to take from this. A lot of little lessons and little hints at what the DCU could look like. And obviously, we're not even going to really know what the DCU looks like until 2 projects at least are out, because right now, it's just Creature Commandos, right? Even with Peacemaker and the Suicide Squad kind of sort of being canon to the DCU, whatever. But we're not going to know what the DCU proper is going to look like until at least Superman, and even then, probably not until a few projects are done and completed with. But I think in general, there is one very good thing about this. One thing that I'm excited about, I should say. Not necessarily good and bad. That's a false dichotomy here. But more just one thing I'm very excited about with James Gunn's approach to the DCU, and one thing I'm perhaps a little more cautious about. I'm not excited about this. I'm not nervous about this necessarily. I just think that this is one of the quote-unquote detriments to doing it this way that I think James Gunn is fully aware of, by the way. But I think that, it's just something that he has considered and decided to take the risk on. So we're going to read some of these quotes here, and then we'll talk about it on the other side. I'm reading this article from the Direct, who has compiled quotes directly from James Gunn. So James Gunn was answering a question on Threads, and the question was, will you ever do a release schedule like Feige for MCU, or will you just say another movie is in development when it starts? James Gunn responds, it won't be exactly like Marvel because nothing is greenlit before we have a finished script. Okay. Then we move on to this next quote here, where James Gunn, this is him talking to Collider. So again, it's not, it's compiled quotes here, but I think that this all tells a story, a very interesting story that I wanted to bring to light here about how the MCU is going to be different from the DCU and vice versa. So this is another quote here from Collider, and James Gunn says, there's no set timeline for anything. The one thing I've tried to make clear to people from the beginning, and the way I hope we're different, is that everything at DC is going to be based on the writers. He then says, this is the same interview, I believe, until we have a screenplay that I'm totally happy with, then that movie is not going to get made, no matter what it is. And so we have been really fortunate with some screenplays, but it's all going to be based on the story, because at the end of the day, if we're happy with the story that we're telling, then that's what matters most. And I think that is, actually, there's one more quote here, as James Gunn is talking about the MCU. So he says here, back in the day, when I came to Hollywood, Scooby-Doo got greenlit because people liked the script. You may not like the movie, but it got greenlit because people like the script. And today, people are greenlighting projects because the IP has to be out on a certain date, which means that the screenplays are worse and movies are suffering for it. So again, maybe not directly about the MCU, but I'm sure in some sort of reference to the MCU. So let's go quote by quote here, as I like to do, because I think that there's a lot to take away from these comments that James Gunn is saying. So first of all, he says, it won't be like Marvel because nothing is greenlit before we have a finished script. Now, for those of you who don't know, Marvel, and I don't think it's the case with every single project they do. I know it's the case for some projects, and maybe even the majority of the projects, where they go in to their productions not having a finished script, and they kind of work on it, along the way. I think that leads to projects like Doctor Strange: The Multiverse of Madness that had some production issues, et cetera, because the script kept changing. And I think that is obviously, I think first and foremost, obviously that's the downside of what Marvel does, especially when the quality control that used to be there with the amount of projects coming out, maybe like 3 movies a year, it's now something like 3 movies and 4 shows a year or something like that. So the quality control that Kevin Feige and his creative team had exerted is not as strong anymore, which means that if scripts aren't done, right, and they're in flux as they enter production, then it's really, it's hard to make those changes. And that's why some projects go through extensive reshoots, etc. Although most big movie projects go through extensive reshoots these days, no matter what they are, even if they're really good, right? So there is that. But yeah, that is definitely the downfall here. And on the surface, sure, it's a great idea. Obviously, have a finished script before you enter production, because you could end up with a project like Multiverse of Madness, which changed many, many times during its production. So there is that. Next thing he says here, there's no set timeline for anything. The one thing I've tried to make clear from people from the beginning is that everything at DC is going to be based on the writers. Again, it's fair, right? It's a fair assessment to say we want the script to be really good before we head into production. And then he says here in the next quote, until we have a screenplay that we're totally happy with, then and he says here that they've been pretty fortunate thus far. So it seems to indicate that the screenplays they've gotten thus far have in fact aligned with the overall story that he wants to tell with the DCU. But he does indicate and he does acknowledge that is not always going to be the case, right? Because sometimes they're just going to be waiting on a project and they're just not going to be happy with it. But James Gunn is saying instead of just going forward with it just because they're going to wait on a good script. And he indicates as much in the final and fourth quote here, where he says, basically, just because they've staked out, I'm just going to make up an MCU movie that's not really been announced, Black Panther 3. Just because, Kevin Feige says Black Panther 3 has to come out in, August of 2028, for example. And it's 2027, and Ryan Coogler is not done with the script, but it's just got to go. James Gunn is saying that is detrimental to the quality of films, and that is, that's basically how it is. So, and films are suffering for it. So there is that. So here is what I will say about this, because again, there are a lot of little lessons to take here. For example, he says that they've gotten lucky so far, so it seems like the scripts that he has seen for the DCU pretty much align with him. I will say basically 3 out of the, I don't know how many projects they've put into production, but 3 out of those projects are his projects, Creature Commandos, Peacemaker, and Superman. So there's the cynical side of me that wants to say, well, James, you say it's all based on the writers, and you say you've been fortunate thus far. That's because you've written about half of what's in production for the DCU. That's the cynical side of me. Again, it doesn't really matter, because he's acknowledging that, sure, that's, that may be the case for now, but in the future, it may not always be the case. But again, I say this because, there's two things I take away from this overall. One, really good, and one, I'm interested, cautious and interested. The really good thing about this is obviously, James Gunn is prioritizing quality, and he's going to say, we want a finished script here before we get on to anything else. And that's great, right? Because that's what we want. We want the quality control that Marvel had so tightly gripped at the beginning. And it seems like they're starting to get back to it for, at this point here. And it seems like James Gunn, who is a great writer, he is a really gifted writer. And if he is the quality control, right, and he reads a script and he's like, nope, we're not ready for it, then, it's not going to happen. That's great. That is great, right? I think that is something that should be admired. And I'm hoping that leads to some great projects. Obviously, James Gunn himself is the one who's written, I think, the first 3 projects of the DCU. Yeah, being Creature Commandos, Superman, and Peacemaker. So, take that for what you will. But I think that overall, that's a really good thing. The other thing, though, the flip side of that, because like I said, the negative part about not having a script in entering production, especially in a shared cinematic universe like the MCU, is you get films like Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, because it was trying to tie into WandaVision, and it was going to come out before Spider-Man No Way Home, and it was going to come out after Spider-Man No Way Home because of COVID delays and production delays, and so they had to change the story. This is what happens. It's a chaotic mess. And I personally think Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness is fine. I think it's fine. But sure, could it have been better if they had really honed in on the script and they had kind of said, let's not really focus on the continuity things, we'll take care of that later? Sure, absolutely. But I will say, it's interesting because one of the reasons the MCU was so successful in the beginning was because of this rigidity in their story structure. And I don't just mean individual movies. I mean the timeline of films that were coming out. Sure, in phase 3 of the MCU, could you have flip-flopped a few projects here and there? Like, would it have made any difference at all if Guardians 2, Spider-Man Homecoming, and Thor Ragnarok, swapped places all around? Not really, no. Because, again, there wasn't a whole lot that just continued to tie into one another until Black Panther kind of ties into Infinity War, Thor Ragnarok, the post-credit scene. So, no. I mean, would it have made a huge difference? No. But, I wonder, right, if Kevin Feige himself was going about the same principle, would it have been possible to have made a cohesive, overarching narrative to the MCU that was so incredibly satisfying in Infinity War and Endgame if you didn't have this rigidity? I don't know. On top of that, I also wonder how much creativity was spawned because of these, forced circumstances where writers and directors were like, okay, we got to figure out this story. I don't know the answer to this. I'm not saying it's a good thing or not. I really am not. I'm just saying, I don't know. Maybe, perhaps. There was some good that came out of it, because look at the 23 MCU projects that came in the Infinity Saga. Iron Man, right? Infamously, Iron Man actually did not have a finished script, and they kept talking about that. Jon Favreau was like, yeah, we shot the movie without a finished script. Iron Man is great. And out of the first 23 projects, I would be willing to bet that not a lot of them had finished scripts entering production, and I love a good amount of them. I like almost all of them. I dislike maybe 1 or 2, and I'm neutral on a couple. Like, that's amazing. So I just think inherently the way that Marvel had been doing it anyways, and it's fine if James Gunn doesn't want to do it this way, but Marvel, the way that Marvel had been doing it inherently, it didn't seem like, as long as they had the quality control of Kevin Feige, didn't seem like it was necessarily a bad thing, actually. And James Gunn saying movies are suffering for it, sure. In general, it's not good to have an unfinished script entering production, but I think the way that Marvel had gotten a handle of it before, obviously, COVID, I think that was a good thing. And the other thing, the flip side of that for the DCU is that I wonder what James Gunn's ability to tell a cohesive story is going to be like if he insists upon this strategy. I'm not saying it's a good or a bad thing. I'm not at all. I just wonder, how are you going to be able to tell a Justice League film? Because sure, you wrote the first 3 projects, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. I think he wrote the first 3 projects, and he seems happy with Supergirl and Lanterns and whatnot. But, let's just say he really wants to tell a what is it, like a Flash movie, for example. Not the Ezra Miller one, but just he wants to tell a Flash movie. And let's just say that in his mind, in his envisioned Justice League film, Flash is a pretty important character, but just the script, just like the original Flash movie, stalls. And it just doesn't get to the place where he wants it to. Are you just going to postpone the Justice League movie indefinitely until you get it right? I don't know. And so I just wonder. I wonder what this strategy is going to do for the cohesiveness of the DCU as a whole. Because again, that is, for all the faults of Marvel post-Endgame, right? And the way that their quality has dipped overall, and the way that they haven't really gotten a tight handle on the ship of the storyline that's going forward towards Secret Wars and Doomsday. It is true, though, I think the flip side is that in the Infinity Saga, it is because of this rigidity of schedule that they were able to pull off what was probably one of the biggest miracles of cinema ever, is just telling one general cohesive story across 23 different projects. James Gunn doesn't seem intent on doing that necessarily, although we'll see if he ever makes a Justice League film or does team-up movies. But if it's really on the script, I just wonder what that's going to look like there. Again, in general, I'm saying this is a good thing, obviously, but I also am curious to see where it will go from here. So we are getting more hints, guys, of the DCU and what it will look like. What do you think about James Gunn's comments here? Do you think this is a good thing? Do you think it's not a good thing? Let me know in the comments down below.